She pulled a dying calf out of the mud while her neighbors were busy laughing at her. They said she was foolish. They said she was desperate. They said a broke widow with 40 acres of hard ground had no business trying to save something that even its owner had already given up on. But Maria Holloway had already buried her husband on that same hard ground, and she understood better than any of them that the things people throw away aren't always worthless. Sometimes they're just waiting for someone stubborn enough to believe in them. This is her story, and it will change the way you think about what gets left behind. If this story speaks to you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Roland Ashcroft abandoned the calf, the sky was the color of a dirty dish rag, pale, flat, and threatening nothing in particular. It was the kind of February morning that didn't bother announcing its intentions. Cold enough to kill if you weren't paying attention, but not dramatic about it. Just cold. Maria Holloway was paying attention. She'd been up since before 4, the way she always was now, ever since Daniel died, and there was no longer anyone else in the cabin to share the work. She'd fed the 2 goats, broken ice off the water trough, and hauled 3 loads of wood from the stack near the tree line. By the time the sun had climbed enough to turn the frost on the fence posts into something that caught the light, she was standing at her east pasture gate with a tin cup of coffee that had already gone cold, watching Roland's crew work the far end of his calving grounds across the boundary line. She wasn't trying to be nosy. Roland Ashcroft's operation occupied the largest spread in the Callaway Valley, nearly 4,000 acres straddling both sides of Sutter Creek, and from her 40 acres, you couldn't help but see what was happening over there. His crew was loud, his equipment was loud, and Roland himself was loudest of all. She heard the argument before she understood what it was about. 2 of Roland's hands were crouched near the creek bank, and Roland was walking toward them with that particular stride of his. Long steps, shoulders back, the walk of a man who never questioned whether the ground belonged to him. She couldn't hear the words from where she stood, but she could read the postures. One of the hands pointed at something on the ground. Roland looked at it. His hands went to his hips. Then he said something short, turned around, and walked back toward his barn without looking back. The 2 hands exchanged a glance. One of them shrugged. Then they both followed Roland. Maria stood there a moment longer, watching the empty space they'd left behind. The cold was working its way through her coat now, through the wool she'd layered under it, and into her shoulders. She drained the last swallow of cold coffee, tasted the grounds at the bottom, and told herself she had her own work to do. She went back inside. She heated the stove. She ate half a piece of bread with the last of a jar of put-up peaches from the previous summer. She washed her cup and set it on the shelf where Daniel's cup still sat. She'd never moved it, which she knew was a choice, and she stood at the window looking at the creek line. She couldn't stop thinking about that shape on the ground near the water. "Hell," she said, to no one. She pulled her coat back on. The calf was alive. That was the first thing she registered, and it surprised her more than it should have. It was flat on its side against the cold mud of the creek bank, head lolling, legs making small involuntary movements that weren't walking and weren't swimming and weren't anything except the body's argument against stopping. It was black, solid black, which was unusual in the valley where Roland ran mostly Herefords and their crosses. And it was small, smaller than small. Either it had come early, or it was the runt of a pair. She couldn't tell yet. She could tell it was dying. The umbilical cord was still fresh, so it hadn't been out here more than a few hours, long enough to get soaked with mud and creek water, long enough to lose heat it didn't have to spare. The temperature had been hovering just above 20 at dawn, and this bank was shaded. The calf was shivering so hard she could see it from 3 feet away. Maria knelt down in the mud. The cold soaked through the knee of her pants immediately. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Settle down." The calf's eye rolled toward her, one brown eye rimmed and wet. It was the most exhausted eye she'd ever seen on something that had only been alive for a handful of hours. She pulled off her coat and wrapped it around the calf before she'd consciously decided to do it. Her brain caught up a second later. You just gave up your coat in 20-degree weather, and she told herself to work fast. The calf was too weak to fight her. She got her arms under it, all 40 or 50 pounds of wet, shivering misery, and stood up. Her back registered a protest. She ignored it. She'd been ignoring her back for 3 years since she'd put it out hauling timber the winter Daniel was sick, and they'd reached an understanding. She started the walk back to her cabin. Across the frost-stiff grass of her east pasture, through the gate she had to swing open one-handed, up the slight rise to the porch. The calf made a small sound against her chest. Not a cry exactly, more like a vibration, something below the level of real noise. She held it tighter. "I've got you," she told it. "You're all right." She wasn't sure that was true, but she'd learned in the past 3 years that there was a category of lie that was different from a real lie. The kind you tell because the alternative is giving up before you start. She put the calf down on the rag rug near the stove and went to work, rubbing it dry with the roughest towels she had, because friction mattered more than gentleness when a newborn was hypothermic. She'd watched her father do this with a lamb once, back in Missouri when she was 10 years old, and she'd helped him do it again at 12, and she'd never had occasion to use the knowledge since, but it was there, stored in her hands. The cabin filled up with the smell of wet calf and wood smoke. It was not a delicate smell. Mireya didn't care. She got it dry. She got a blanket around it. She built the stove up high enough that the room got uncomfortable, and she took her sweater off. The calf's shivering began to slow, which was either a good sign or a bad one. She'd need to watch which direction this went. The problem was feeding. She had colostrum knowledge, but not colostrum. She'd have to improvise, and she'd have to do it soon. Newborns had a window, and this one had already burned through most of it lying in the mud. She heated whole milk from her one remaining dairy goat, Poppy, a bad-tempered Nubian who had opinions about everything and communicated them clearly. Added an egg yolk, a spoonful of molasses, and a pinch of salt, which was the recipe her father had used and which she could not have cited a scientific source for. She cooled it to body temperature by touch. She found a soft rag, tied it into a knot, soaked it in the mixture, and knelt back down on the rug. The calf wouldn't take it at first. "Come on," she said. "You don't have to want it. You just have to do it." She got her thumb into the corner of its mouth, gently, like someone who'd done this before, even though she hadn't, and eased it open enough to get the rag in. The calf worked its jaw once, twice, then something switched on behind those exhausted eyes, and it began to suck. She sat on the floor next to a calf she didn't own in a cabin she couldn't afford to heat any higher, on a rag rug that was already going to need washing, and let out a long, unsteady breath. "There," she said. "See? That's all it was." The question of what to do about Roland came sooner than she'd expected. She'd been at the east fence an hour before Roland's foreman, a lean, sun-dried man named Pickett, came riding along the property line with the kind of expression that meant someone had sent him to deliver news he didn't particularly want to deliver. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, touching his hat. He always called her Mrs. Holloway, which she appreciated. Some of the men in the valley had moved to just Mireya after Daniel died, which they seemed to think was friendly, and she found presumptuous. "Mr. Pickett?" Mr. Ashcroft wondered if you'd happened to see one of his calves. "Black one. Born early this morning." She met his eyes. He was a decent man, Pickett. She'd always thought so. His expression gave her nothing, which told her he already knew the answer. "I have it," she said. He nodded slowly. "Mr. Ashcroft says it's a dead loss. Too small, wrong confirmation, Dam rejected it. He's not looking to claim it. He's abandoning it." Pickett's jaw moved slightly. "He's making a practical decision about resource allocation. He left it on a creek bank to die." A pause. "Yes, ma'am. And you're here to tell me he's not claiming it, which means I can have it. If you want it." The way Pickett said it suggested he thought the question of wanting it was not entirely straightforward. "Mr. Ashcroft says you're welcome to it. He says..." Another pause. "He says it'll be dead by Sunday anyway, so there's no loss to either party." Mireya looked at him for a long moment. The wind came up the slope from the creek and pushed at both of them. "Tell Mr. Ashcroft thank you for his generosity," she said, in a voice that meant neither of those words. Pickett touched his hat again and turned his horse around. He didn't say anything else. She had the feeling he was the kind of man who knew when not to. The news moved through Callaway Valley the way news always did, faster than seemed physically possible given how spread out everyone was, and in a form slightly different from the original. By the time it reached the far end of the valley, the story was that the Holloway widow had stolen a dying calf off Roland Ashcroft's land because she'd gone a little strange since her husband passed. By the time it circled back, Mireya had become a woman who believed the calf could talk to her. She heard various versions of this from various sources. The version she heard from Agnes Dowd, who ran the dry goods store with her husband and who was fundamentally kind but constitutionally incapable of keeping information to herself, was relatively gentle. Agnes told her that people were worried about her, that it seemed like a sad thing, that maybe she should reconsider whether 40 acres on her own was practical. The version she heard from Cord Neely, who ran cattle on the adjacent property to her north, and who had been low-grade hostile to her ever since she'd beaten him in a fence-line dispute 18 months ago, was less gentle. Cord had come to her gate on a gray afternoon and told her directly that she was wasting whatever she had left to waste, that the calf would die and she'd have gotten nothing for her trouble except a cabin that smelled like a barn, and that a sensible woman in her position would sell the land and move somewhere that made more sense. She'd thanked him for his concern and closed the gate. The calf, meanwhile, survived the first week, then the second. The reason it survived, Mireya would say later, was about 60% stubbornness, hers, and 40% a 73-year-old man named Otto Brenner, who lived in a sod-roofed cabin 2 miles east of her place, and who almost no one in the valley talked to because he was German, because he'd arrived here from somewhere else 20 years ago with habits and methods that didn't look like anyone else's habits and methods, and because he had strong opinions about soil drainage that he was willing to explain at length if you gave him any opening at all. Otto appeared at her cabin door 4 days after she'd brought the calf in. She hadn't met him before except to wave at, which she'd done twice from across the road. He was a small man, considerably shorter than she'd have guessed from a distance, with a white beard that he kept trimmed with serious intention and hands that looked like they'd been worked hard for 50 years and found it agreeable. He had a jar in his hand. He held it out. "Bees," he said. "For the calf. Colostrum. From my cow 2 days ago. She had twins. More than enough." He saw her expression. "Fresh frozen. I keep some always. It will help." She took the jar. It was still cold from outside. She didn't quite know what to say. "How did you know?" she asked. He shrugged. "Small valley. I hear things." A pause. "Also, I could hear the calf from the road this morning. The sound it makes. It is not yet strong enough. But it is trying." She stepped back from the door. "Do you want to come in?" He came in. Otto Brenner, she would discover over the following weeks, was a man of extensive and specific knowledge, most of which had been acquired in circumstances he was willing to describe but not to dwell on. He'd raised cattle on a small farm in Bavaria, had come to America with his wife in 1862, had lost her to fever in Kansas City, and kept moving until he ran out of the will to move, which had happened here in the Callaway Valley, more or less arbitrarily. He did not consider the valley special. He considered it adequate. He was also one of the most practically competent people Mireya had ever met. "Your colostrum substitute," he said, looking at her mixture, which she'd written down in the notebook where she kept household accounts. "The egg yolk is good. The molasses, yes. Energy, this is correct. But you are missing fat. A newborn in cold weather needs more fat." He considered. "Do you have lard?" "Some. Add a small amount, not much. And you should feed 6 times a day, not 4. "I'm sleeping." "Yes." He looked at the calf, which was asleep on the rug with its knees tucked under it. "You will sleep less." She did sleep less. She fed the calf 6 times a day, then worked backward from 6 to 5 as the calf grew stronger, and she found she could read its signals better, when it was hungry, when it was satisfied, when it was simply bored and making noise about it. She learned to tell the difference between a cry that meant "feed me" and a cry that meant "I am uncomfortable," and a cry that meant "I would like company," which was a thing she hadn't expected a calf to have opinions about, but this one did, loudly. Otto came by 3 or 4 times a week. He never stayed long. He would look at the calf, ask questions about what she'd observed, offer a piece of information or a correction, drink 1 cup of coffee, and then leave. He was not a warm man, exactly. Warmth wasn't the right word for him, but he was steady, and steadiness, in Mireya's current circumstances, was worth more than warmth. "What are you going to call it?" he asked, about 10 days in. The calf was attempting to stand with some success. It had been attempting to stand for 3 days. Each time it got to its feet, it looked deeply uncertain about what it had achieved and what to do next, which Mireya found more endearing than she wanted to admit. "I don't know yet," she said. "In Germany, some people believe you should not name a calf until you know it will live." He watched the animal wobble on 4 legs, catch itself, wobble again. But I think that is fear making itself sound like wisdom. She thought about that. Ember, she said. It surprised her slightly. She hadn't known she'd decided, because it was almost out, but it wasn't. Otto looked at the calf. The calf looked at Otto with the brown-eyed seriousness of an animal that had no idea it had been given a name, but was prepared to take it seriously anyway. Ember, Otto said. Yes, this is a good name, Tito. By the end of March, Ember was living in the small lean-to shed attached to the east side of Maria's cabin. She'd reinforced it against wind, put down deep straw, and rigged a system of boards that allowed her to close it off from the elements without losing ventilation. It wasn't a barn. It was barely a shed. But Ember was in it and appeared to have made his peace with this arrangement. He was eating real feed now. Good grass hay, a little grain, fresh water twice a day, and growing. Not fast by anyone's standard, but growing. The black coat that had looked dull and staring when she'd pulled him out of the mud now had the beginning of a gloss to it. His legs, which had seemed so improbably thin, were filling out. He stood with more confidence. He came to the fence when she approached. That last part was something she noticed but didn't talk about. Cattle weren't dogs. They weren't supposed to behave like that, coming toward you instead of away, following with their eyes, making that specific low sound that was below a moo and above nothing. But Ember did all of these things, and she suspected it was because she'd been the first thing he'd experienced when he was most likely to die, and he'd attached whatever attachment a calf had to give to the person who'd been there. She didn't talk about it because she knew what it would sound like. She was at the feed store in town in late March, the town being Marsden, a 40-minute ride from her property, built around a railroad spur and a water tower, and a general conviction among its residents that it was going to be bigger than it was. When Roland Ashcroft saw her across the main street and said something to the man standing next to him, she didn't hear what he said. She saw the other man look at her, and then look away, and then try not to smile, which told her enough. She went into the feed store and told Hank Dormer she needed 2 50-pound sacks of alfalfa pellets and a block of mineral salt. Hank looked up from his ledger with the particular expression she'd gotten used to seeing. Not quite pity, not quite amusement, something hovering uncomfortably between the two. "How's that calf doing?" he asked. "Growing," she said. He wrote her order down. A lot of people figured it was a lost cause. A lot of people were wrong. Hank didn't say anything to that. He handed her the order slip and she paid and waited for the boy to load her wagon, and when she drove back down Main Street, she looked neither left nor right. She was 6 weeks into owning Ember when the money became an emergency. She'd known it was coming. The number had been in her ledger for months, circled in pencil, and she'd been looking away from it the way you look away from something you're not ready to face yet. Daniel had left debts, which she'd known about and had understood were manageable as long as she made certain decisions about the farm. She'd been making those decisions. But the winter had been harder than she'd calculated. The goat had produced less milk than expected, and she'd spent money on the calf that she'd been setting aside for something else. There was a payment due on the land. $63 to the bank in Marsden by the 1st of May. She had 41. She sat at her kitchen table after supper on a March night with the ledger open in front of her and went through the numbers 3 times because the 4th time wasn't going to change them. The fire was low. Outside, she could hear Ember moving in the lean-to, the small thuds of a growing animal shifting its weight. She could sell something. The question was what? She'd sold almost everything she could sell that wouldn't compromise the operation. She still had the 2 goats, but one was a milker and the other was pregnant, and she'd need both. She had her wagon horse, Willis, who was 12 and not worth much, and who she was not going to sell. She had some tools and some furniture and some of Daniel's things which she'd been keeping because they were Daniel's things, but which were not, when she was honest with herself, contributing to her survival. She went to bed without deciding anything. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind off the mountains and thought about Ember and what 40 acres of hard ground was actually worth to her and whether she was being practical or stubborn. And she couldn't quite tell the difference, which was the problem. Dosek. Otto found her the solution, though he didn't present it that way. He came by on a Tuesday morning, and she made the mistake of looking unhappy when she answered the door. He looked at her face for a moment and then came inside and sat down at the table and said, "Tell me." She told him about the $63. She wasn't sure why she told him. She hadn't told anyone, didn't plan to tell anyone, considered financial difficulty a private matter by nature. But Otto had that quality of asking questions in a tone that assumed you had reasonable answers, and it made her want to provide them. $63, he said, by May 1st. He was quiet for a moment. I owe you something, he said. You don't owe me anything. The Brenners owed the Holloways something, he said, which didn't make sense as far as she knew because she hadn't known either of the Brenners before this winter. He saw her expression. When I first came here, 19 years ago, I came with nothing and I tried to winter here and I would have failed. Your husband's father, Old Man Holloway, gave me hay, 2 loads of hay when I had nothing left. He would not take payment. He paused. I never paid it back. He died before I had enough to pay it back. She looked at him. Daniel never mentioned that. He would not have known. It was before Daniel was old enough to know. He folded his hands on the table. $63. I have it. She shook her head immediately. I'm not taking money from you. It is not a gift. It is a loan. At no interest, which a bank will not offer you. He held up a hand before she could object again. I'm 73 years old and I have no children, and I have money in a box under my floor that I do not spend because there is nothing I need. I'm not asking you to accept charity. I'm asking you to let me make a practical arrangement that is also, coincidentally, an old debt repaid. She looked at her table, at the ledger, at Daniel's cup on the shelf. You said your husband would not have known, she said, but he knew the kind of man his father was. He told me... She stopped. He told me about the time a neighbor needed help pulling his wagon out of a creek in a flood, and his father was there before anyone else was. That's the kind of man he told me about. Otto waited. All right, she said. A loan, and I'll pay you back. I know you will, he said. That is why I offered. But April in the valley was a complicated month. The frost came and went and came again. The creek ran high with snowmelt and then steadied. The cottonwoods along the water came into leaf in the second week and turned the creek line the particular pale, new money green that always made Mireia feel like something was possible. Ember was 3 months old and the size of a large dog, which was to say, not large. But he was healthy. His coat had a real shine now. His eyes were clear. He ate well and drank well and followed her along the fence line when she moved through the pasture. He had opinions about being touched. He liked his ears rubbed, but didn't like the area near his pole, which she'd discovered by accident and which he'd made her aware of clearly, though without malice. She hadn't said this to anyone, but she liked him. She hadn't expected to like him. She'd expected to feel the animal satisfaction of having saved something, which was different from liking. But there was something about Ember's specific personality, the watchfulness, the way he'd tilt his head at unusual sounds, the absolute confidence he had about what he did and didn't want, that she found herself looking forward to. She'd go out to the lean-to before breakfast, and he'd come to the fence and she'd scratch behind his ears, and they'd stand there in the morning cold for a few minutes, 2 beings in the same small world, not much to say. It was the most comfortable she'd felt in a year. She told this to no one, obviously. Well, the first time Roland Ashcroft came to her gate was in the last week of April. He rode up alone, which surprised her. Roland Ashcroft generally moved with at least one person nearby to confirm the importance of his movements. He sat his horse at her gate and looked at the pasture and at Ember, who had come out of the lean-to and was standing in the pale sunlight with the easy self-possession of an animal that had never known predators. Mireia came out of the cabin and stopped on the porch. Roland was a big man, well-dressed for the frontier. Not fussy about it, but his clothes were good quality and he kept them in good repair, which in Mireia's estimation was the useful kind of vanity. He had a face that might have been handsome 20 years ago and was now just confident, which served him well enough. He looked at the calf for a long time before he looked at her. Mrs. Holloway, he said. Mr. Ashcroft. That your calf? Yes. He's looking well. He is. A pause. The wind moved through the new cottonwood leaves down toward the creek. I'll give you $30 for him, Roland said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, No, thank you. His expression didn't change much, but she saw something shift in it. Not anger yet, just the small recalibration of a man who'd expected a different answer. He's a nice-looking calf, but I wouldn't say he's a $30 calf. I'm being generous. Then you should find someone who needs your generosity, she said. He's not for sale. Roland looked at the calf again. His jaw moved once. What do you plan to do with a single bull calf, Mrs. Holloway? You're not running a herd. Not yet, she said. Another pause. He looked at her now, with the look people gave when they were trying to decide whether you were serious or simple. She'd gotten used to that look. Good day, Mr. Ashcroft, she said. He touched his hat and turned his horse. She watched him ride back down toward the road, and she noticed that he went slowly and that he didn't look back, but that his posture was the kind that was trying to look like it didn't care and working a little too hard at it. She went back inside and sat down at the table. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she found annoying. The conversation had gone exactly as she'd wanted it to go. The fact that her hands were shaking was the body having its say, even when the mind had already made the decision. He'll be back, she said, to the empty cabin. She was right about that, but she had time. She had Ember, and she had 40 acres, and she had Otto's hay wisdom and her own stubbornness and $22 in the box in the cupboard after paying the bank. And she had, though she couldn't have fully explained why she believed this, the conviction that something she was doing here mattered. The valley had laughed at her. Roland Ashcroft had written Ember off as a dead loss and left him in the mud. She was betting everything that they were both wrong. Outside in the spring pasture, Ember lifted his head and looked east toward the mountains, and the morning light caught his coat and turned it not black but something richer, the color of deep water, the color of good soil, the color of things that had survived what they weren't supposed to survive. He was a calf, just a calf. But Maria Holloway was watching him grow, and she was starting to understand that she'd pulled something out of the mud that February morning that was going to be very difficult for anyone to dismiss again. The summer came in hot and stayed that way. By June, the creek that ran along Roland Ashcroft's south boundary, the same creek where he'd left Ember to die in the February mud, had dropped 8 inches from where it usually sat. Nobody said anything about it yet. Creeks dropped in summer. That was ordinary. But Maria had been watching that water level since March, measuring it the way her father had taught her to measure things you couldn't afford to be surprised by. And what she saw in June was not ordinary. The drop was too fast and too early, and the snowpack on the eastern range had been thin coming out of winter, which meant there wasn't the usual reserve waiting up there to ease the summer along. She mentioned it to Otto on a Thursday morning when he came by to look at Ember, which he did most weeks now with the quiet regularity of someone who had decided a thing was worth watching and was going to watch it properly. The creek's low, she said. Otto was leaning on the fence post, studying Ember with his arms folded and his hat pushed back on his head. Ember was 8 months old now, and the change from the February calf was the kind of change that made you look twice, then look again. He stood almost to Maria's shoulder. His legs had grown into themselves, long and straight and solid, with the kind of bone density you could see even under the muscle that was starting to fill out his frame. The black coat had deepened into something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, the way a good piece of ironwood did. He was not yet a bull in the full sense, but he was getting there, and the direction was clear. Yes, Otto said. I have been watching. How bad do you think it gets? He was quiet for a moment. Otto was a man who didn't give you a number until he was confident in it. I have seen 2 droughts in this valley, he said finally, one in 1871, one in 1878. This feels like the beginning of the 3rd. If I am right, he paused. If I am right, it will be worse than either of those. She absorbed that. When? The real damage? Next summer. Maybe the summer after. But the preparation must start now. He looked at her. You know your well. South corner of the east pasture, 22 feet. How much water do you pull from it in a week? She calculated. 40, maybe 50 gallons? You need to go deeper. 30 feet at minimum. 40 if you can. He looked out at the flat of her land, and she could see him reading it the way a person reads something written in a language they know well. Your land sits lower than Ashcroft's on the north side. There is water under it that his operation will not reach, but you must go down to find it. Deepening a well costs money. Yes. He didn't add anything to that. He didn't need to. She looked at Ember, who had lost interest in being observed, and had wandered to the far side of the pasture to investigate something in the grass. He moved with an ease she found. She didn't have another word for it. Beautiful. There was no wasted motion in him. Every step he took landed exactly where it needed to land. "All right," she said. "Who do I talk to about the well?" But his name was Cal Drury, and he was the only well digger in the valley who wasn't also something else first. He came out on a Friday afternoon, walked her property for about 20 minutes, crouched in various spots, and pressed his palm flat against the ground in a way that looked entirely unscientific and probably was, then stood up and told her she was sitting on good water at 36 feet and that he could reach it for $22 and the use of her wagon for one Saturday. $22 was most of what she had left after the bank payment. "I'll need 2 weeks," she told him. "3," he said. "I got Neely's place and a kitchen cistern at the Dowd house first." She paid him the first half up front and spent the next 3 weeks adding a line of expenses to her ledger that made her stomach hurt when she looked at it, and which she looked at anyway, because the alternative was pretending the numbers were different than they were, and she'd made a policy of not doing that. While Cal Drury worked his way through the valley's other jobs, she started the water reservoirs. It was Otto's idea, practically speaking, though he laid it out as observation rather than instruction. He had a way of describing what he'd done on his own place that amounted to the same thing as a recommendation without carrying the weight of advice, which she appreciated. He'd built 2 rock-lined holding tanks in 1876, before the 1878 drought, and they'd allowed him to maintain his small herd through a summer that had killed off most of a neighbor's cattle and all of another's. Maria had rock. The valley had rock everywhere, which was one of its persistent inconveniences, and which she was now prepared to find useful. She spent 3 weeks moving stone, which was the kind of work that made her back communicate with her in terms she couldn't ignore, and which she did anyway, early in the mornings before the worst of the heat came down, and in the evenings when it lifted. She built 2 tanks, one near the well site, one near the east fence where the natural ground slope would allow gravity to do some of the filling work during rain. She did not mention this project to anyone in town. She wasn't hiding it exactly. She just didn't volunteer it, and no one asked because no one was paying attention to what Maria Holloway was doing with her 40 acres and her orphaned bull calf. They were too busy not worrying about the creek. Roland Ashcroft came back in July. He didn't come to this gate this time. He stopped on the road that ran along her western fence line and looked over it from horseback, the way you look at property that interests you without wanting to give the impression it interests you. He had Pickett with him, and one of his other men whose name she'd never learned. She was working on the second reservoir tank when she saw them, and she kept working because the rocks weren't going to move themselves and because she didn't want to walk over there and have the conversation that was clearly coming. Roland eventually got off his horse and came to the fence anyway. "That's a reservoir," he said. "Correct," she said. "In case of what?" She straightened up and looked at him. "Dry summer. Summer's always dry." He looked around at her pasture, which was, she noticed him noticing, greener than the surrounding land. She'd been applying the water carefully, not lavishly, not wastefully, but with attention, which was what good pasture management actually required, and which most people in the valley did not do. "Your grass is holding up well." "Thank you." "I'm not complimenting you," he said flatly. "I'm observing." "I know," she said. He looked at Ember, who had been moved to the west pasture for the day. "The bull?" She was beginning to think of him as a bull in something more than the technical sense. Stood at the far end of the enclosure, looking back at Roland with the calm, steady attention he gave to most things he found only mildly interesting. Something moved in Roland's face when he looked at Ember. She'd noticed it the first time he'd come to the gate in April. He had the expression of a man doing arithmetic about something he wished he didn't have to do arithmetic about. "That calf has grown," he said. "He has." "What are you planning to do with him?" "I'm keeping him." "You keep saying that. But you're a small operation, Mrs. Holloway. You can't breed him effectively on 40 acres. You don't have the cows." "Not yet," she said for the second time. She'd said it in April, and she was saying it now, and she intended to keep saying it until it was no longer necessary. Roland's expression did something complicated. "I'll give you $120. The number landed between them. It was nearly twice what she had in the box in the cupboard. She was aware of that, and she was aware that he was aware of it, that he'd done some calculation about what a widow on 40 acres needed and had set his number accordingly. "No," she said. "Mrs. Holloway, he's not for sale, Mr. Ashcroft." She picked up the next rock. "I've got work to do." She heard him standing there for another moment. Then she heard him walk back to his horse. She didn't look up. The rocks moved slowly in the July heat. Her hands blistered in two places that had already calloused and blistered before, and the blisters broke by afternoon, which was uncomfortable in the specific way that familiar discomforts were. Not shocking, just present. She worked until the light told her to stop, and then she went inside and washed her hands in cold water and cooked a meal she was too tired to taste and ate it standing at the window, looking at Ember in the last of the evening light. $120. She was not going to second-guess herself. She'd made the decision, and the decision was made, and the reason she knew it was the right decision was the same reason it had always been. Roland Ashcroft wanted the bull, and Roland Ashcroft was not a man who tried to buy things that weren't worth buying. Cal Drury hit water at 34 feet on a Thursday in August, and Mireia felt something release in her chest when he came up out of the hole and told her. She'd been carrying the held breath of that number since she'd contracted him, and 34 was close enough to his estimate that she believed it, and the water that came up in the sample bucket was clear and cold and tasted like nothing at all, which was the taste you were looking for. She paid him the second $11 and thanked him, and then went and sat on the porch for a while and didn't think about anything in particular. Sometimes, after you'd been holding something for long enough, the only thing to do when it resolved was to sit down. Otto came by the next morning. She showed him the well and the two tanks and the connection she was planning to rig between the well crank and a gravity feed line to the first tank. He looked at all of it and said, "Good." Then he said, "The tanks need covers." "I know," she said. "Evaporation." "And contamination," he said. "Birds." She built the covers. By the end of August, she had a functioning water system that was not elegant. It was boards and rock and rope and a hand crank that gave her a blister in a new place every third use. But it worked, and it held water, and it was hers. Ember turned one in February of the following year, and Mireia marked the occasion by giving him an extra portion of grain and telling him about it, which she did in a matter-of-fact voice that acknowledged she was talking to a bull and didn't particularly apologize for it. He received this with his usual equanimity. He was large now, not finished growing, not by a long way, but large enough that visitors to the property who hadn't been watching the progression did something when they first saw him, a kind of involuntary recalibration. You couldn't look at him and see the same thing twice. He was enormous, not fat. There wasn't an ounce of unnecessary weight on him, but massive in the way that some animals were massive, the way that made you understand why certain bloodlines got famous. His chest was deep, his back was level, and he carried his head with a calm authority that she found, privately, a little funny. He hadn't lost any of the specific personality she'd known from the start. He still liked his ears scratched and disliked the area near his pole. He still came to the fence when she appeared. He had added, over the past year, a tendency to express dissatisfaction with specific grain formulations by simply not eating them, which had required her to experiment until she found the ratio he preferred, which she had done without considering whether it was strictly necessary. It was not strictly necessary. She did it anyway. The valley, that second winter, had been drier than normal. The creek, which had already worried her in June, hadn't recovered the way it usually did. Old Cal Drury, who paid attention to water the way his profession required, told her in November that his measure stick on Sutter Creek showed the lowest winter reading he'd recorded in 11 years. People around town received this information the way they received most uncomfortable information, with a period of brief concern followed by a general agreement that things would sort themselves out, because things always had. Mireia listened to this and kept building her water reserves. Cord Neely rode past her east fence on a morning in March and stopped his horse and stared at Ember for longer than was comfortable. Then he rode to her gate and called for her, and she came out. Cord Neely was not her favorite person in the valley. He had been unpleasant about the fence dispute, and unpleasant about Ember, and unpleasant in general, in the particular way of men who had been slightly more successful than their abilities should have allowed, and had drawn the wrong conclusion from this. But he was her nearest neighbor, and it cost nothing to be civil. "That's the Ashcroft calf," Cord said. He was still looking at Ember. "It was," she said. "He abandoned it. I raised it. I know the story." He finally looked at her. "What's his breeding?" "I don't have his papers. Whatever Roland was running at the time, Hereford crosses mostly." Cord was quiet. He had his hat in his hands, and he was turning it, which he did when he was thinking about something he didn't want to say directly. "He looks like more than that," he finally said. I know, she said. There's talk he's got some Devon in him. Someone's grandsire imported Devon bulls 20 years back, and the blood moves around. He put his hat back on. If that's right, he's not just a big bull, he's a productive one. Devon cross throws calves that can handle hardship better than the straight Herefords. She absorbed this. Who's saying that? People who know cattle. He paused. Roland Ashcroft, for one. She looked at him. He's saying it quietly, Cord said. But he's saying it. He seemed to make up his mind about something. I've got 3 cows haven't settled after 2 seasons. If your bull is what he looks like, I'd want to talk about a breeding agreement. The sentence landed differently than she'd expected. Cord Neely was not a man who came to people looking for arrangements. He came to people to tell them what they were doing wrong. I'd need to think about it, she said carefully. Fair enough. He started to turn his horse, then stopped. I'll say one thing, Mrs. Holloway. I laughed at you when you hauled that calf home. I thought you were... He stopped, started again. I was wrong about that. It was the most expensive thing she'd ever seen Cord Neely say. He clearly did not enjoy saying it. Thank you, she said, and meant it without making a production of it, because she understood that he was doing the same. The spring of that year was wrong from the beginning. The rains that usually came in March came in the first week and then stopped. April was dry. May was dry in the way that was different from a dry May. Not just absent rain, but a quality of dryness in the air that pulled moisture from everything it touched. The creek dropped to half its normal level. The grass on the unirrigated sections of the valley turned a color that was supposed to be midsummer yellow but arrived in May, which meant the summer itself was going to be something else entirely. People started talking about it now. The general agreement that things would sort themselves out was developing cracks. You could see it in the way ranchers stood at fences looking at their cattle, and in the quality of silence at the feed store on Saturday mornings, and in the way Hank Dormer started accepting partial payments on feed accounts that he'd always required settled in full. Mireya's pasture was still green, not lush. She wasn't being lavish with the water, and she wouldn't be, but holding. The grass had the color of something with enough to drink. Ember's enclosure showed it most clearly. The ground around his water trough was the only deep green in a pasture that was otherwise going toward straw yellow at the edges, and it showed the math of what she'd built plainly. Water held, water applied carefully, grass surviving. She was aware this was being noticed. 3 of her neighbors, not just Cord Neely, but Agnes Dowd's husband Frank, who ran 30 head on the parcel to the south, and a quiet Scotsman named McRae, who had land east of Otto, came to her gate in the space of 2 weeks to ask about the well. She told them what she'd done and what it had cost and where Cal Drury was located, which was information she gave freely because withholding practical information from people who needed it had never seemed like a useful way to live. None of them, she noticed, asked about Ember, but all of them looked at him before they left. The breeding agreement with Cord Neely was the first one she signed, in June of that second spring. She spent 3 evenings on the terms, which was longer than the length of the document warranted, but shorter than she needed to make sure she was satisfied with every sentence. The agreement was simple. His 3 unproductive cows would be brought to her pasture for breeding. She would cover feed during the period, and they would split the proceeds from the resulting calves at weaning, 60% to her and 40% to him. Cord had pushed back on 60-40. She'd held it because the 60% was the fair number given that she was providing the animal, the management, and the risk. And she knew it was the fair number, and she told him so plainly enough that he eventually agreed. The first cow came over in late June, the second in July, the third in August. Ember approached each of these situations with the same matter-of-fact confidence he brought to everything, which Mireya observed from a careful distance and found reassuring. Frank Dowd came with a similar proposal in August. McRae in September. She negotiated each agreement separately and didn't apologize for the terms, which were consistent. 60-40, feed costs on her side, calf split at weaning. Everyone pushed back. She held the terms with all of them. Otto watched all of this from the edge of her porch one Saturday morning when she was going over the third agreement. "You are becoming a businesswoman," he said. "I was always a businesswoman," she said, without looking up from the paper. "I just had less to offer before." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "This is true," he said. Then, "The calves will be remarkable." She looked up. "You sound certain." "I have watched cattle for 50 years, he said simply. "I am certain." She looked at the papers. Then she looked out at the pasture, where Ember was standing in the late September light, his enormous black frame absolutely still against the gold of the dry grass on the valley floor, and everything above him bright, and everything around him quietly, stubbornly, refusing to be ordinary. "I know," she said. She went back to the agreement. The valley had laughed at her. Roland Ashcroft had made his offer 4 times now, and each time the number had gone up. And each time she'd said no, and each time the no had cost her something in the short term and returned it with interest in the long term, which was the only equation she'd found that consistently balanced. Outside, the creek was lower than it had ever been in June, and the sky to the south was the particular bleached white of a sky that had given up on rain for the season. She could feel, in the quality of the afternoon air and in the numbers in her ledger and in the look on her neighbors' faces when they came to her gate, what was coming. She was ready for it, not comfortable. She wasn't comfortable, and she didn't expect to be, but ready, which was the only kind of ready that actually counted. The first cattle died in July, not Mireya's. Frank Dowd's. 3 yearlings on his south pasture that had been struggling since May, and finally ran out of the will to keep struggling on a Wednesday afternoon when the temperature hit 103 and the creek on that side of his land had reduced itself to a series of disconnected muddy pools that smelled wrong in the heat. Frank found them in the morning and stood there for a while looking at them, and then he rode to the feed store and told Hank Dormer, and by the time the information had moved through the valley, it had expanded to include a general and unspoken acknowledgement that what was happening was not a dry spell. It was a drought, the real kind. Mireya heard about the yearlings from Agnes Dowd, who came by on a Friday with a jar of preserved plums she said she had extra of, which Mireya accepted with genuine gratitude because she was low on preserves and because Agnes's real reason for coming was obviously to talk, and that was fine. Agnes sat at the kitchen table and turned the jar in her hands and said that Frank was up at night, that he'd been up at night for 2 weeks, that the creek on their south end was gone and the north end was going, and he'd calculated that without rain by the end of the month, he'd be selling off half his herd at whatever price he could get before they started dying on him. "Half his herd," Mireya said. "At minimum." Agnes set the jar down. Her hands were not entirely steady. "We've been out here 22 years, Mireya. We've had dry summers. We've had hard winters. We have never—" She stopped. "Frank says he's never seen the ground look like this in July. He says the ground looks like September." Mireya didn't have anything useful to say to that, so she poured more coffee and let Agnes talk, which was what Agnes needed. After Agnes left, she went out to check her tanks. The first tank was at about 70%, lower than she wanted, but workable. The second on the east side was running better because of the gravity slope, and she'd been conservative with the draw on that one. The well was down 3 feet from its original level, which Cal Drury had told her to watch for, and which he'd said was expected in a dry summer and not yet worrying. Not yet. She stood at the east tank and ran through her numbers. She had, she calculated, enough water to maintain her small pasture and her livestock through October at current usage rates, possibly into November if she was careful. She had 2 goats, Ember, and the 6 cows currently on breeding agreements, Cordneely's 3, plus 1 each from Dowd and McRae, and a widow named Clara Fent who'd approached her in May with a cow that hadn't settled in 3 years, and which Ember had apparently found unremarkable as a challenge. The cows from the neighbors would need to go back soon, she knew. Their owners needed them home. What those owners would find when they got home was a different problem. Ember was 2.5 now, and whatever she'd seen beginning in him that first spring had finished becoming what it was going to be. He stood 18 hands at the shoulder. His head was massive and calm, and he carried it low when he was relaxed and level when he was interested in something, and he was almost never agitated. The black coat was a thing that visitors commented on without being able to explain exactly what they were commenting on. Not color exactly, because black was black, but something about the quality of it, the way it lay, the depth it implied. He was built, Otto had said once, the way good tools were built. For work, not for looking at, though looking at him was something you did anyway. He had sired, in the past 18 months, 14 calves across the valley's scattered herds. Not all of those calves had made it. 2 had been lost to early sickness, 1 to a predator. But the 11 that remained were, by any fair assessment, remarkable animals. They were growing faster than their half-siblings from other bulls. They were holding condition in the drought better than the older cattle on the same properties. A rancher named Burl Sampson, who ran 120 head on 300 acres in the north end of the valley, and who had initially declined to talk to Maria at all because he considered her operation beneath serious consideration, had ridden past the Neely place in June and seen Cord's ember calves next to Cord's other calves, and then ridden directly to Maria's gate and asked her how soon she had availability. She'd made him wait 3 weeks before she gave him an answer. She was not, she would have told you, being difficult. She was being precise, which was different. She needed to understand exactly what her operation could support before she committed to anything. The last thing she wanted was to overextend and then fail to deliver, because failing to deliver would undermine everything she'd built, and she'd built it too slowly and at too much cost to risk it on ambition that outran her capacity. The 3 weeks she made Burl Sampson wait, she spent with a pencil and paper going through every number she had. At the end of those 3 weeks, she told him she could accommodate 4 cows in the spring breeding season at the same terms she offered everyone. 60-40 split on weaning proceeds, feed on her side during the agreement period. He negotiated. She held the terms. He agreed. The man from Denver arrived on a Tuesday in the first week of August. His name was Garfield Pruitt, and he came by the twice-weekly stage from Marsden with a leather case and a quality of clothing that belonged in a Denver hotel lobby and looked notably out of place standing on the dirt road outside Maria's gate. He was perhaps 50, well-fed in the way of men who ate at good tables regularly, with a mustache that was kept with more intention than anything else about his face. He'd sent a letter ahead which she'd received 4 days earlier and read 3 times. He represented a livestock development concern out of Denver called the Territorial Breeding Association, and he had, he wrote, been receiving reports about a bull in the Callaway Valley that had come to the attention of several serious cattlemen. He would like, at her convenience, to come and have a look. She'd written back a single sentence. Come on Tuesday. Come alone. He came on Tuesday. Came alone, or appeared to. She later learned he'd left a second man at the Marsden Hotel, which she found interesting but not surprising. She met him at the gate and led him to the pasture without making conversation about it. She'd learned over the past 2 years of negotiations with the valley's ranchers that the person who talked first about the thing both people were there to talk about was almost always the person who needed it more. She let Ember do the talking. Pruitt stopped walking when he saw the bull. He stopped in the way that people stopped when they were trying not to show that they'd stopped, which meant he stopped for about 2 seconds before he deliberately continued walking. But she caught it. They stood at the fence for 10 minutes. Ember, entirely indifferent to the attention, grazed his way along the far edge of the enclosure and then came partway back toward them when he noticed Maria, then lost interest in Pruitt and went back to the grass. How old? Pruitt asked. 2 years? 6 months? And the breeding record? She had it in her notebook, which she'd brought. She handed it over. He read it slowly, which told her he was either very careful or performing carefulness, and she wasn't sure yet which. These calves at the Neely place, he said. Can I see them? You can ask Cord Neely, she said. That's his property. He handed the notebook back. He looked at Ember again for a long moment. Mrs. Holloway, the Devon cross in this animal. Do you have documentation? No, she said. I don't have his papers. He was abandoned as a newborn. What you see is what the bloodline is. Pruitt was quiet. He was the kind of man who thought about money while looking at something else. I won't insult you with a preliminary number. I appreciate that. What I can tell you is that the Territorial Breeding Association would be interested in discussing an acquisition. He's not for sale, she said. Pruitt blinked. It was a small blink, the kind that meant the sentence had landed differently than expected. The bloodline, then, a stud rights arrangement. That I'm willing to discuss, she said, on terms that reflect what the bloodline is actually worth, not what's convenient for your association. He looked at her for the first time as if she were the same kind of person he was, which was, she decided, progress. What figure are you working with? I'm not working with the figure yet, she said. That's what discussions are for. When you've seen the calves at the Neely place, and whatever else you need to see, I'll hear what you're prepared to say. He left without a number being exchanged. She watched the stage take him back toward Marsden, and then went inside and sat down and felt the particular exhaustion of having performed steadiness for 2 hours when she had not been entirely steady on the inside. She wrote the conversation down in her notebook, because she wrote everything down. Pruitt's visit was the end of the quiet period. By the following week, the news that a Denver buyer had come to look at the Holloway bull had traveled through the valley with the specific velocity of information that changes the way people calculate things. She began to see it immediately in the way conversation shifted when she came into the feed store, in the way men who'd been politely dismissive now made eye contact and held it a second too long, looking for something to read. Roland Ashcroft, she heard third hand through Agnes Dowd, had gone to the Marsden Hotel and found Pruitt there and had a meeting with him that lasted most of an afternoon. She heard this on a Thursday. On Saturday, Roland came to her gate. He came without picket this time. Just himself, on his good gray horse, at 8 in the morning when the light was still low and the heat hadn't established itself yet. She was at the well crank when she heard him call her name, and she took her time finishing the draw before she walked over. He looked different than he had in April. Not older, exactly, but more careful. The easy confidence was still there. Roland Ashcroft's confidence was structural. It lived in his bones. But there was something working underneath it now that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I'd like to have a serious conversation." "We've had several," she said, "a different kind." He took off his hat, which was a thing he didn't usually do, and she noted it. "I spoke with Pruitt." "I know." He didn't seem surprised that she knew. "What he told me about the bloodline value, the numbers he's working with." He paused, adjusted something. "You're sitting on a significant asset." "I'm aware." "My operation has 180 breeding cows," he said. "Your bull has proven calves in this valley, and a Denver buyer already interested. If we combined your bloodline, my scale, you want a partnership," she said. "A merger, more accurately. I have land, infrastructure, market relationships. You have the bull," she said. "The bull," he agreed. She looked at him. She took her time with it. What would this merger look like, specifically? He laid it out. It was, she had to admit, well constructed. Her operation would be absorbed into Ashcroft Cattle under a shared entity. She'd receive a percentage of breeding revenues. He said 30%, which he presented as generous. Her 40 acres would become part of the Ashcroft holding. She'd have a management role, title unspecified. She listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she said, "You're describing a purchase, Mr. Ashcroft. You're just describing it as a partnership so that I'll feel better about selling." Something moved across his face. "It's a fair offer." "It's a 30% offer on something I built from nothing on land I own outright." She kept her voice level. "You're offering me a minority stake in my own bull and no actual ownership of anything. If I sign what you're describing, I'm an employee." "A well-compensated—" "No," she said. His jaw tightened. It was the first time she'd seen his jaw do that. "Mireya." First name, she noted that too. "You're a single woman managing 40 acres in a drought that is going to get worse. Pruitt's offer, whatever it is, will come with strings that favor Denver. I'm local. I know this valley." "You left a calf to die in the mud in February because you calculated he wasn't worth the trouble," she said. "Your judgment about what's valuable and what isn't something I'm prepared to rely on." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that had weight to it. Roland put his hat back on. His voice, when it came, was still controlled, but the quality of the control had changed. It was the control of a man managing something that would otherwise show. "You should think carefully about what you're deciding." "I have," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Ashcroft." She walked back to the well crank. She heard him sit there for another moment. Then she heard the gray horse move off down the road at a pace that was not quite as unhurried as it wanted to seem. The drought hit its worst in August. What had been a dry summer became something that used the word drought the way drought was supposed to be used, as a disaster that was happening in real time, not a condition you talked about in future tense. The creek on Roland's south boundary stopped running entirely in the first week of August. The North Creek, fed from higher up, was down to a thin thread over bare rock. The valley floor, which should have been dry gold summer grass, was dust in the low places and cracked earth in the middle ones, with grass that crumbled when you picked it up. Cattle losses started accelerating. Burl Sampson sold 40 head at the Marsden stockyards for prices that made the men standing around the auction ring quiet with something that wasn't embarrassment exactly, but was adjacent to it. Frank Dowd sold his yearlings and most of his cow-calf pairs. A rancher named Garrett, whose operation was in the south end of the valley, simply walked away from it, packed his family into a wagon and left, and the cattle he didn't take stood around his dry water troughs until his neighbors rounded them up and absorbed them or moved them to the stockyards. Through all of this, Maria's 40 acres held. She was not comfortable. She had reduced her water draw to the minimum that kept the grass alive and the animals functional, which meant that some mornings she looked at her pasture and it looked worse than she wanted it to look, and she'd go back inside and not think about it for an hour before she had the steadiness to come back out. She had miscalculated her reserve usage twice, once in June, once in late July, and had to make corrections that cost her 2 weeks of careful management each time to recover. Nothing about it was easy. She'd stopped pretending it would be. But Ember's calves, when Cord Neely's 3 cows went back in early August, were the most visibly healthy animals in the valley. Cord had tried, the week before, to renegotiate the split from 60-40 to 50-50, citing the drought's effect on his costs. She'd listened to him fully and then told him the terms were the terms and that he'd agreed to them when things looked easier and agreements didn't change value based on which direction the weather went. He'd accepted this with the expression of a man who was annoyed primarily because she was right. The calves were worth it. She knew they were worth it. Cord knew they were worth it. What she hadn't expected was how clearly this would register on Roland Ashcroft. It registered in the specific form of a rumor that started sometime in the second week of August and had completed its circuit of the valley by the end of the third. She heard the first version from McRae, who stopped her on the road and had the particular discomfort of a man delivering news he found distasteful. The version he'd heard was that Maria Holloway had water under her land that she was sitting on, not just her well and her tanks, but a significant underground reserve that she was drawing from privately while her neighbors' herds died, and that she was doing this deliberately for leverage, intending to let the crisis peak before offering her resources at crisis prices. She stood in the road and listened to McRae tell her this, and was careful not to show on her face what she was doing on the inside. "Who's saying this?" she asked. McRae turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the road. "I heard it from 2 men. One of them works for Ashcroft." She said, "Thank you, Mr. McRae," and rode home. She put her horse up and went inside and sat at the table with the notebook open in front of her without writing in it for a while. She was angry, which she'd expected to be. What she hadn't expected was the particular quality of the anger. Not hot, not sharp, but solid and cold, the way iron was cold in winter. The kind of anger that didn't want to do anything with itself right now, but was going to want to do something eventually. Roland had turned down in public negotiations. He'd tried to buy the bull 4 times. He'd offered a merger she'd refused. And now, because none of that had worked, he was trying to do what men in his position did when direct methods failed. He was trying to make the valley afraid of her. A widow who was hoarding water, while your cattle died. She understood the calculation. A desperate community needed a reason for its desperation, and a villain was neater than a drought. If Roland could make her the reason, or even part of the reason, he could let the valley do his work for him. He could position himself as the man willing to help, the reasonable one, the one who'd tried to work with her and been refused. She wasn't going to let that happen, but she had to be careful about how she didn't let it happen, because the wrong move now would confirm the story rather than refute it. She wrote in the notebook for a long time. Pruitt came back in the 3rd week of August. He came with his associate this time, a younger man named Estes who took notes and said almost nothing. And he came with a number. He sat at her table and laid it out. The Territorial Breeding Association was prepared to offer an exclusive stud rights agreement covering a 3-year period for a guaranteed payment of $800 per year, plus a percentage of verified calf sales attributable to the bloodline. $800 a year was more money than her operation had made in any year since Daniel died. More money than the farm had made in any 2 consecutive years before that. She didn't let this show. "The exclusivity clause concerns me," she said. It's standard for your association," she said. "For me, it means I can't honor the agreements I have with my current partners. I have 6 ranchers who have standing breeding arrangements with Ember. I won't breach those agreements to satisfy an exclusivity clause." Pruitt looked at Estes. Estes wrote something. "We could carve out existing agreements," Pruitt said. "New agreements going forward would be exclusive to the association." "And the pricing on new agreements, who sets that? The association would set standard rates? Then the pricing isn't mine," she said. I'm not interested in an arrangement where I give up control of pricing. I've spent 2 years establishing what this bloodline is worth. I'm not handing that to a Denver board to determine. Pruitt leaned back slightly. He had the look of a man recalibrating in real time. What would you propose? She told him. Non-exclusive arrangement. Fixed payment for stud rights documentation and bloodline certification, which the association could then use to market proven offspring. She retained pricing and agreement authority for all direct breeding arrangements. She would provide Pruitt's association with access to records and confirmation of lineage, and they would in return provide market access to buyers in Denver and beyond who wanted certified Emberline calves. It was not what he'd come for, but she'd spent the 3 weeks since his first visit figuring out exactly what she was willing to give and what she wasn't, and she'd arrived at those terms through arithmetic, not emotion. They talked for 2 hours. The terms moved somewhat from where she'd started. She conceded a right of first refusal on future stud rights expansion in exchange for a higher certification fee, and settled somewhere that was not everything she'd wanted and not what he'd wanted and was therefore probably close to correct. I need 3 days, Pruitt said. Take them, she said. She stood up. One more thing, Mr. Pruitt. Yes. There's a story going around this valley that I'm sitting on water reserves I'm withholding from my neighbors. I'd like you to know, before your association's name gets attached to mine, that it's not true. My reserves are functional, but not excessive. I've offered water to 3 neighboring families already. I'm willing to offer it to any family in this valley who needs it for household use and their milk cows. Pruitt looked at her steadily. Why tell me? Because in a week, I'm going to make that offer publicly, she said. And I'd rather your association know now than read about it later and wonder what it means. He nodded once. It was the nod of a man who'd just added something to his estimation of the person sitting across from him. She didn't acknowledge it. She walked him to the door and watched the stage road until it was empty again. Then she went back to her notebook and wrote down every word of the conversation while it was still exact, because everything that happened from here was going to matter, and she intended to have the record of it when it did. Outside, the valley baked. The dust rose from Roland Ashcroft's south pasture in thin columns that looked, from a distance, like smoke. Ember moved slowly through the afternoon heat with the deliberateness of an animal that had learned early what it cost to survive and had never forgotten it. The worst of the drought was still ahead. She could feel it in the air and in the ground and in the conversation she was having, and she knew that what was coming was going to be harder than anything that had come before. She was afraid. That was the truth of it. But fear, she'd learned, was not the same as wrong. And the preparations she'd made in the years when the valley was laughing at her were about to become the only thing standing between her and everything Roland Ashcroft intended to take. She made the offer on a Thursday morning. She rode into Marsden and asked Hank Dormer if she could put a notice in the window of the feed store, which was the closest thing the valley had to a public board, and Hank said yes with the careful neutrality of a man who had already heard both sides of several things and was not prepared to attach himself to any of them. She pinned the notice herself. It was 12 lines, written in the plain hand she'd developed keeping ledger accounts, and it said that any family in the Callaway Valley who needed clean water for household use and their milk cows was welcome to bring containers to the Holloway property on Tuesdays and Fridays, no payment required, and that this offer would remain open as long as her reserves held. She rode home and went back to work. The first family showed up the following Tuesday. It was a young couple named Trescott who'd come to the valley 2 years earlier and whose small operation on the eastern edge was one of the first to go fully dry. Their well had been shallow to begin with, 30 feet of optimism sunk in hard ground, and it had given out in July. They came with 4 wooden barrels and a wagon and were clearly expecting some kind of transaction, some condition attached. The wife, who was maybe 23 and had the look of someone who hadn't slept well in a month, held her youngest on her hip and stood back while her husband talked. Maria showed him the tank and the draw system and said, "Take what you need." "What do you want for it?" the husband asked. His name was Peter. He was trying to look like the question was practical and not the kind of question that cost him something to ask. "Nothing," she said. "Fill your barrels and come back Friday if you need more." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the tank. Then he started filling the first barrel without saying anything else, which was, she thought, the right response. By the end of that first Tuesday, 4 families had come. By the following Friday, 7. The week after, 11. She kept a count in the notebook. Not for leverage, not for anything she planned to use, but because she kept records of things, and this was a thing worth keeping a record of. None of this solved the underlying problem, which was that the valley's cattle were still dying, and the creek was still low, and the sky was still wrong. But it did something to the quality of how people looked at her when she came into town. Not warmly, not yet, and not universally. There were still people who received the rumor Roland had set loose as more convincing than what she was actually doing, but something had shifted, the way something shifts when a story people have been told starts to develop complications they can't explain away. Roland noticed. She knew he noticed because Pickett came by on a Wednesday, which was not a Tuesday or a Friday, and asked if he could fill 2 buckets for a family on the Ashcroft property whose well had gone bad. She filled his buckets. She sent him home with the buckets full, and didn't say anything about what it meant that Roland Ashcroft's foreman was the one who'd come rather than the family themselves, and didn't say anything about the fact that Roland had, presumably, plenty of resources of his own to solve a water problem for a family on his land. She just filled the buckets. The crowd came on a Saturday. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of horses and wagon wheels on the dry road, more than 1 or 2, and voices carrying in the still August air. She was at the east tank when she heard it, and she stood up straight and looked toward the road and felt something in her stomach that she identified precisely and without drama as fear. There were 14 of them. She counted as they came through the gate, which she had not locked because she'd never locked it, and she wasn't going to start doing things differently out of fear. Roland was not at the front. He was positioned slightly back, which she noted and filed. The front was Cord Neely, which surprised her. Cord had been irritating but not hostile, and she'd thought the breeding agreements had established something between them, not friendship, but some version of mutual respect. Behind Cord was Burl Sampson and 2 of his hands, and Frank Dowd, which surprised her more than Cord had. She'd filled Frank Dowd's wife's water barrels 6 times in the past 3 weeks. She looked for Agnes in the group and didn't see her, which told her something about the argument that had probably happened at the Dowd house before Frank left that morning. Behind them were men she knew less well, ranchers from the north and south ends of the valley. A couple of men she recognized from the feed store without knowing their names. And at the back, slightly separate, Roland on his gray horse with the look of a man who had organized a thing and intended to watch it from a position that allowed him to claim he hadn't organized it. Cord stopped about 20 feet from her. "Mireya," he said. "Cord," she said. "We need to talk about the water situation." She looked at the group. Then she looked at Cord. "All right," she said. "Talk." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "You've got reserves. We know you've got reserves. People are losing cattle, and you're sitting on water that could—" "I've been offering water twice a week," she said. "Every family in this valley knows it. 11 families took water last week. Your operation is welcome to it." "That's household water," Cord said. "That's buckets. We need water for livestock, real water, enough to get cattle through until the rains come." She looked at him steadily. "My reserves are enough to maintain my operation and offer household water for the families in this valley. They are not a municipal water supply. I built 1 well and 2 tanks on 40 acres. I am 1 person." "You could share access to the well," someone in the back said. She didn't see who. "The well services my tanks," she said. "The draw rate isn't sufficient to supply additional herds. That's not a policy decision. That's physics." Roland moved his horse forward. He came through the group to the front with the ease of a man moving through space that was already his, and she watched him do it and kept her face still. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, and his voice carried the particular register he used when he wanted to sound reasonable in front of witnesses. "No one here doubts your property rights. But we are looking at a community crisis. People have lost their livelihoods. Families are in serious trouble." He paused, letting the weight of that settle on the group. In situations like this, community members support each other. That's what makes a valley into a community instead of just a collection of separate problems. It was a good speech. She gave him credit for it. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said, "you've been running cattle in this valley for 15 years. You have 4,000 acres, 2 creek sources, and a payroll that tells me you have capital available. How many families in this valley have you given free water to this summer?" Silence. "How many families have you let defer lease payments when their operations ran dry? How many did you buy feed for when the prices went up? How many times did your crew show up to help a neighbor move cattle before they died?" She was careful to keep her voice level. Not cold, not heated, just present. I'm asking honestly, because if the answer is that you've done all of those things and I've missed it, I apologize for the question. The silence had a different quality now. Roland's jaw was doing the thing she'd seen it do before. That's not the issue. It is, though, she said. You're asking me to be the community's resource because I prepared for what everyone could see coming, and you're framing it as selfishness that I prepared and others didn't. She looked away from Roland and looked at the men in front of her. At Cord, at Frank Dowd, at Burl Sampson, at the men from the North End she didn't know well. 2 years ago, I told every person who came to my gate that the creek was dropping too fast. I told Cord in March of last year. I told Frank in April. I told anyone who would listen that the snowpack was thin and the summer was going to be hard. She paused. Most of you didn't think I was worth listening to. The widow with 40 acres and a calf, nobody wanted. Frank Dowd looked at the ground. Cord was still meeting her eyes, but just barely. I'm not saying that to make you feel bad, she said, and meant it. I'm saying it because the story Mr. Ashcroft is telling you, that I'm the problem, that I'm hoarding, that what you need is what I have, and I'm keeping it from you. That story is not about your cattle. It's about my bull. She let that sit. A couple of the men in the back shifted. Roland's horse moved a step and he stilled it. Roland has tried to buy Ember 4 times, she said. He offered me a partnership last month that would have made me a minority stakeholder in my own operation. I declined. So now he's here, and you're here, and the reason he needed you here is that coming alone to take what I have doesn't work as well as bringing 14 people and calling it a community concern. Roland said, That is a serious accusation. It's an accurate one, she said, and you know it. Another silence, longer this time. She could hear the wind moving the dry grass, and somewhere down near the road, one of the horses shifting its weight. She had planned what she was going to say next. She'd planned it the night before, lying awake with the notebook open on the table and the lamp burning low, writing and crossing out and rewriting. Not because she expected this specific group on this specific morning, but because she'd understood for 3 weeks that something like this was coming and she'd wanted to know what she believed before she had to say it out loud in front of people. I'm not going to surrender my ranch, she said, and I'm not going to give Ember to Roland Ashcroft or anyone else. That's settled. She watched the group process that. But here's what I will do. She looked at Cord first, then Frank, then moved her eyes across the faces she knew. Any family in this valley, not ranching operations, families who needs water for their household and their milk cows, I will keep supplying it free until the rains come or my reserves run out, whichever happens first. That offer stands and it's already standing, and you know it. She paused. For the livestock situation, I've signed an agreement with the Territorial Breeding Association in Denver. Part of that agreement gives me access to certified bloodline documentation that makes Ember's calves worth real money on the Denver market, not the Marsden stockyard prices. Denver prices. She looked at Cord. You've got 3 calves from Ember. Under the association certification, those calves are worth 3 times what you'd get at auction in this market. I will process the documentation for every rancher in this valley who has an Ember calf. At my cost, not yours. She heard someone in the group make a sound. She didn't stop. And going forward, when the rains come, when this valley is trying to rebuild, I will sell future calves from Ember's line at fair prices. Not crisis prices. Fair prices. The same as I'd charge in a good year. I won't exploit what you're going through to make myself rich. She stopped. Let it land. That's my offer. Not because anyone forced it out of me. Because it's the right way to do business with people you're going to be neighbors with for the rest of your life. The quiet after she finished was a different kind of quiet from the one before she'd started. It was the quiet of people recalculating. Cord Neely was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. He opened his mouth and then closed it, which was unusual for Cord, who generally had opinions queued up and ready. Frank Dowd said quietly, I knew Agnes was right to fill those barrels. Roland moved his horse forward another step. His voice, when it came, had lost the public reasonable quality and found something harder underneath. This is a performance, he said. She's managing her image because a Denver buyer is in town and she wants to look like a community figure. Ask yourself who benefits from this arrangement long term. Ask yourself who ends up owning the valley's bloodline and setting the prices on your cattle's future. Some of the men looked at Roland. Some of them looked at her. She waited. Burl Sampson, who had said nothing up to this point and who was a man of very few words in any situation, spoke up from the middle of the group. His voice was flat and unhurried. "Roland, you tried to buy that bull 4 times, and she said no 4 times. You lost fair. Let it go." Roland looked at Sampson. Something happened in his face that she couldn't fully read. Not quite shock, but the expression of a man who'd miscounted his allies. "This isn't about—" "It is, though," Sampson said, using her exact words back at Roland, which she thought might have been intentional and which she appreciated more than she showed. "She's offering something fair. I've got 2 ember calves, and if she can get me Denver prices on them instead of what Marsden's offering right now, that's the difference between whether I'm still here next spring." He looked around at the group. "That's my vote. Anyone else?" It didn't happen all at once. Nothing real ever did. It happened the way a crowd's attention shifts. One person, then another, then the weight of it tipping past the point where it was balanced. Cord Neely said he was in. One of the men from the North End, she heard his name was Garrett, not the same Garrett who'd walked away from his operation, a different one, said it sounded fair. Frank Dowd was already nodding. Roland sat on his horse and watched his leverage leave the room, which in this case was a dusty yard in August, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who had played a hand badly and knew it and was trying to decide whether to fold gracefully or make it worse. He made it worse. "You'll regret this," he said. Not to the group. To her. She looked at him. "I've regretted things," she said. "Most of them were things I did out of fear. I'm not afraid of you, Mr. Ashcroft." He turned his horse and rode out through the gate. 2 of his men followed. The rest of the group stayed. What followed was not a celebration. It was more uncomfortable than that. 14 men standing in a yard realizing they'd shown up to something they didn't fully come to terms with, and a woman who'd held her ground now having to figure out what to do with the people who'd come to take it, and decided not to. She did the only practical thing, which was to tell anyone who wanted to talk about the documentation process and the Denver pricing to come back on Monday, and to tell Frank Dowd specifically that Agnes was welcome to bring her barrels on Tuesday as usual, and that she hoped Frank would come with her. Frank said he would. He said it in the voice of a man doing something harder than it looked. She accepted it in the same register. Cord Neely was the last to leave. He stood by his horse for a moment after everyone else had started moving toward the road, not quite looking at her and not quite looking away. "I should have listened 2 years ago," he said, "about the creek." "Yes," she said. She didn't soften it, because softening it would have been a different kind of disrespect. "But you're here now." He put his hat on. "Monday," he said. "I'll be here Monday." "I'll have the paperwork ready," she said. She watched them all go. When the last wagon had rounded the bend in the road and the dust had settled back to the ground, she stood in her yard in the August heat and let herself feel, for a few minutes, exactly what she felt, which was not triumphant and not relieved, but something more complicated. Wrung out mostly, the way a cloth was wrung out when you'd gotten everything useful from it, and at the same time strangely intact. She went to check on Ember. He was in the east enclosure, standing in the narrow stripe of afternoon shade thrown by the fence. He looked at her when she came to the gate and came over with his usual lack of urgency, and she put her hand on his nose and he allowed it, which was the specific tolerance he extended to her, and not to most other people. "They came," she told him. She wasn't sure why she was telling him this. The habit of talking to him had grown over 2.5 years into something she didn't bother explaining anymore. "Most of them stayed." Ember breathed against her hand. His eyes were deep brown and calm, and entirely without opinion about the morning's events. "Roland's going to try something else," she said. "He's not done." She knew this the way she knew weather sometimes. Not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of signs read correctly. Roland Ashcroft was not a man who accepted a public loss and moved on. He had too much invested, financially, and in the more fragile currency of how the valley saw him, to absorb what had happened this morning without looking for a way to restore the balance. She didn't know what form it would take. She was going to have to be ready for forms she hadn't anticipated. "Oh, Mama?" Otto came by that evening. She hadn't sent for him, but she hadn't needed to. He had a quality of showing up when things had happened that she'd stopped questioning and simply accepted as part of who he was. He came in, sat at the table, and she told him the whole morning from beginning to end, which took about 20 minutes. He listened without interrupting, When she finished, he sat for a moment. "Burl Sampson," he said. "Yes. I did not expect that." "Neither did I," she said. Otto looked at the table. He is a practical man. He does what works. He paused. Roland will go after the agreement with Denver next. He will try to intervene with Pruitt, offer something the association finds more attractive. She'd considered this. He can't offer what I have. No. But he can complicate it, delay it, create doubt. Otto folded his hands. The agreement. How solid is it? Pruitt said 3 days, 3 weeks ago. He hasn't come back with the signed version yet. Otto was quiet in the specific way that meant the silence was saying something. "I know," she said. "I need to go to Marsden and push it forward." "Yes," he said. "Before Roland does." She went to Marsden on Sunday. Pruitt was still at the hotel, which she'd been half afraid wouldn't be the case. He received her in the hotel's small sitting room with Estes and the leather case and the look of a man who had been doing arithmetic for 3 weeks and had arrived at a number he could live with. They signed the agreement on a Sunday afternoon in the Marsden Hotel, while outside the windows the valley baked in the worst drought in a generation, and inside it was dim and smelled like old wood and lamp oil. She read every line before she signed it. Estes witnessed it. Pruitt kept one copy, and she kept one, which she folded into the inner pocket of her coat and kept there for the 3-day ride home. She passed Roland's gate on the road back. The gray horse was in the paddock near his barn. She didn't stop. She didn't slow down. She rode past at the same pace she'd ridden past it 100 times in the past 3 years. Because the gate was just a gate, and the road was just a road, and the paper in her pocket was real. The Monday meeting was not elegant. 11 ranchers came. 2 sent their foreman. 1 sent a written note asking about the process, and including an apology that was brief and somewhat formal, and which she accepted in the spirit it was offered. She sat at her kitchen table with the notebook and the certification paperwork Pruitt had left her and went through the documentation requirements with each person one at a time. It took most of the day. Her kitchen was not large. By noon it was hot, and the coffee had run out and she was tired in a way that went past her muscles and into something deeper. But she kept going because the work required keeping going, and because every rancher who sat across her table with their breeding records and their calf tallies was a version of the relationship she was going to need the valley to become if the next years were going to be survivable for any of them. Cord Neely sat across from her in the afternoon, and they went through his 3 calves line by line. He was careful and thorough, and when they were done he sat back and said, "You really think Denver prices?" "I know Denver prices," she said. "Pruitt showed me the current market. Your calves, certified Devon Cross, drought-resistant lineage documented, will sell for twice the floor at Marsden and possibly better." Cord was quiet for a moment. "You could have sat on this," he said. "You could have let the drought run its course and then sold the calves yourself at whatever price you wanted." "Yes," she said. "But you're not." "No." He looked at her in a way he hadn't looked at her before in 2.5 years of being her nearest neighbor. "Why not?" She thought about how to answer that, not because she didn't know, but because the real answer wasn't simple and she wanted to say it right. "Because this valley is where I live," she said finally. "Daniel is buried on this land. I'm going to be here for the rest of my life, and you can't build a life on land where everyone around you has failed. Your failure is my problem eventually. My preparation should be your opportunity. That's how it's supposed to work." She paused. "It doesn't always work that way, but that's how it's supposed to." Cord said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're a strange woman, Mireya Holloway." "I know," she said. He almost smiled. "I mean it as a compliment." "I know that too," she said. He left. She sat in the quiet of her kitchen in the late afternoon with the stack of completed paperwork and the empty coffee pot and the particular exhaustion of a day that had required her to be more than one person at once. She was not finished. Roland was not finished. The drought was not finished. There were things ahead that she didn't know the shape of yet. But the paper was signed, and in Denver tomorrow it would be filed, and 11 ranchers had sat at her table today and treated her like someone worth sitting at a table with. That was what the day had been. She was going to let it be exactly that, without making it more or less than what it was. She went out in the last of the evening light to feed Ember. He came to the fence, and she stood with him in the cooling air and didn't say anything for a while. She was too tired for talking, even to a bull. The valley spread out below her property in the long golden light, dry and cracked and hard, and every bit of it still there, still itself, still waiting for rain. She was waiting too, but she was waiting from solid ground. The rain came on a Thursday in late October, not dramatically. No storm front, no lightning, no sky tearing itself open the way drought breaks sometimes did in the dime novels Daniel used to read on winter evenings. It came as a gray morning that stayed gray, and then as a smell in the air that Mireia recognized before she understood it, and then as drops on the dry boards of the porch, so light and tentative that she stood under the eave and held her palm out and counted them, one by one, as though they needed to be verified. By noon it was steady. By evening it was real. She stood at her east pasture fence in the rain without a coat, which was not practical, and which she did anyway, because there are moments when the practical thing is not the only consideration. The water ran off the hard-packed earth in thin sheets at first, the way it did when ground had forgotten how to absorb things, and then gradually, as the hours passed, it began to soak in. The cracked surface softened, the dust became mud. The smell of it was the most specific smell she knew, old earth remembering what it was for. Ember stood at the far side of the enclosure with the rain darkening his coat from black to something deeper, and he looked, as he often did, entirely unbothered by whatever the sky was doing. She laughed. She hadn't planned to. It came out of her the way things came out when they'd been held too long. Not quite a sob, and not quite relief, and not quite joy, but something that used the body's laugh machinery to say something the words didn't have room for. She went inside and changed her wet clothes and built the fire up and sat at the table with the notebook open and wrote, October 23rd. Rain, 2 words. The most important 2 words in the ledger. The weeks that followed were not a restoration. Restoration implied returning to what had been, and what had been was gone. Garrett's abandoned operation was still abandoned. Several herds were still diminished past recovery without significant investment, and the valley's relationship with certainty had been altered in the permanent way that hard years altered things. People who'd been through the drought had a different look to them now. Not broken, most of them, but recalibrated. More careful about assumptions. More willing to look at a creek level in June and think seriously about what it meant. This was, Mireia thought, not entirely a bad thing. Roland Ashcroft's situation resolved itself before the rain came, which was a thing she'd not anticipated and which she learned about from Pickett, who came to her gate on a gray morning in early October with his hat in his hands and an expression that told her this was not a visit he'd been sent on. He's selling, Pickett said. The north parcels first, the creek land. He's got loans called in for Marsden and the Denver Bank both, and the herd losses this summer put him past what he can service. She took this in. How much of the operation? Don't know yet. Could be all of it eventually. Pickett was looking at his hat. He was a decent man, as she'd always thought, and this was clearly costing him something. I wanted you to know before it's general knowledge, because of everything. Thank you, she said. She meant it simply. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He started to turn and then stopped. Mrs. Holloway, what you did this summer, the water, the documentation, all of it. He paused, assembling words carefully. There were men in that group on Saturday who came ready to take what you had. You know that. I know, she said. You didn't give them reason to. She looked at him. You were there. I drove Mr. Ashcroft, he said. I didn't get off my horse. He adjusted his hat once more. I'll say good morning. She watched him ride down the road and thought about the specific courage of a small correction. The kind that didn't announce itself as courage. The kind that just moved 1 inch in the right direction and didn't make a speech about it. Pickett had driven his employer to her gate on a Saturday morning and sat on his horse and not gotten off. And that was what it had looked like from the outside. And perhaps that was all it had been. But she didn't think so. The Denver papers on the 11 calves came through in November. Pruitt sent a rider from Marsden with the documentation and a letter that confirmed market placement for 8 of the 11 animals, with offers ranging from what Mireia had estimated on the low end to considerably more on the high end for Cord Neely's best calf, which Pruitt described in the letter as an exceptional specimen of the developing bloodline, in the careful language of a man who wanted her to know he understood what she had without giving her more leverage in future negotiations. She delivered the papers to each rancher personally. She rode the valley over 3 days in early November, the ground soft under Willis's hooves, and the grass beginning its tentative return in the low places where the water had pooled, and she knocked on gates and handed over envelopes and watched people open them and do the arithmetic she'd already done for them in the margins. Cord Neely opened his envelope at his gate and looked at the number for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "This is real?" "It's real," she said. "This is... Mireya, this is..." He stopped. Started again. "This is what I needed to stay." "I know," she said. He looked up. He was not a demonstrative man, which she knew and respected. "Thank you," he said. Just that. But he said it in the voice of a man who meant all the words that were behind it and didn't have a way to say them, and she accepted it in the same spirit. Frank Dowd's envelope made Agnes cry, which Frank seemed both moved by and uncomfortable with in equal measure. Burl Sampson read his, folded it back into the envelope, put the envelope in his coat pocket, and said, "Good," which was, from Burl Sampson, a significant response. Clara Fent, the widow whose cow had come to Ember in late spring, opened her envelope at her kitchen table with Mireya sitting across from her and her 3 children present, ages about 8, 10, and 12, all of them with the alert eyes of children who had been paying attention to adult stress for several months and knew that the envelope mattered. Clara read the number. She set the paper down on the table. She looked at Mireya. "This changes things," she said quietly. "Yes," Mireya said. The oldest child, a girl, looked at the paper and then at her mother's face, and then at Mireya with the particular focus of someone filing away information they would use later. Mireya had the feeling, looking at that girl, that she was looking at someone who would be running something in 15 years and would do it competently. Roland Ashcroft sold the north parcels in November and 2 more sections in January. What remained of his operation by spring was less than a quarter of what he'd run at his peak, a core of land near his original homestead holding, a reduced herd, and the infrastructure of a larger operation that now mostly served to make the diminishment visible. He didn't leave the valley, which surprised some people, and didn't surprise Mireya. Men like Roland didn't leave. They reduced and remained and built an alternative story about what had happened that put their choices in the best available light. And then they lived inside that story until it felt true enough to continue with. She had no particular satisfaction about this. What had happened to Roland was the consequence of his own decisions across many years. The overextension, the borrowed capital, the calculation that the valley's resources were subordinate to his management of them. She hadn't caused it. The drought had accelerated it, but it would have arrived eventually in some form because the math had been wrong for years, and wrong math has a way of becoming a crisis whether or not a drought comes along to hurry it. The thing she felt about Roland, when she examined it honestly, was not satisfaction and not pity. It was something more like recognition, the understanding that there was a version of herself that could have been him if she'd had his resources and his certainty about who the valley was for, and that the difference between them was not purely character, but partly just circumstance. She had started small and stayed careful because she had no other option. Roland had started large and grown careless because he'd had options he didn't know he was misusing until they ran out. That was the kind of thought she kept to herself. By the following spring, Ember's calves were in 9 operations across the valley. Not all of them were thriving equally. 2 ranchers who'd signed agreements in the rebuilding period after the drought had management practices that limited what even a strong bloodline could accomplish. And she told them so directly, which one had received as useful information and one had received as an insult. She couldn't control that. She could control the quality of what she offered and the honesty with which she offered it. What people did with it after that was theirs. Otto watched all of this with the quiet attention he brought to things he considered worth watching. He was 75 now, and the winter had been harder on him than he showed. She could see it in the way he moved across uneven ground, more carefully, more slowly, the particular caution of a man who had learned to trust his body less. She had started coming to his place instead of waiting for him to come to hers, which he hadn't acknowledged directly and which he hadn't objected to. On a March morning, she found him sitting on his porch in the thin early spring sun with a cup of something and a look on his face that was not unhappy, but was the look of a man thinking about the longer view of things. She sat in the other chair. He poured her a cup from the pot beside him. It was some kind of herb tea, not coffee, which told her the coffee had run out and he hadn't ridden to Marsden for more, which told her something she added quietly to the growing account she kept of what he needed and wasn't asking for. They sat for a while without talking, which was the comfortable kind of silence that you could only have with someone you'd been honest with regularly for several years. "The Brenner land," Otto said eventually. She looked at him. "I have been thinking about what happens to it." He was looking at the view from his porch. Not particularly dramatic, just the valley floor and the tree line and the mountains behind it, the same view she'd ridden past 1,000 times. "I have no family. There is a nephew in Baltimore who I have not seen in 30 years and who would sell this land within a month of receiving it. The land would go to someone who does not know it." She waited. "I would rather it went to someone who knows how to read it," he said. "The water, the drainage, where it sits in relation to the snowpack." He looked at her. "I have been to see the lawyer in Marsden." "Otto, I am not dying," he said, with the slight impatience of a man who had anticipated the objection. "I am planning. These are different activities." He picked up his cup. "It is done. When the time comes, the Brenner land goes to the Holloway operation. You will not talk me out of it, and I would prefer you do not try." She looked at her own cup for a moment. The tea was some kind of dried flower, she thought. It tasted like spring, and like something she didn't have a name for. "Your father gave my husband's father 2 loads of hay," she said. "Yes. The debt has been repaid several times. Debts between neighbors are not accounting problems," he said. "There's something else." He looked at the mountains. "I want the land to stay what it is, that is all. The land understands certain things about water and about waiting. You understand the same things. This is not complicated." She didn't say thank you because she knew he didn't want that, and because some things sat better without the weight of gratitude attached to them. She just sat there in the March sun on his porch and drank the flower tea and let the decision be what it was. "The calves this spring," he said after a while, moving on in the specific way he had of moving on when something was settled. "Cord's cow from the fall breeding. She is carrying twins." "I know," Mireya said. "He's panicking about it." "He should be prepared," Otto said. "Twins in a Devon cross can be difficult." "I told him. He said he'd read about it." Otto made the sound that was not quite a laugh. "Reading about it and being ready for it at 3 in the morning are separate experiences." "I told him that too," she said. "Good." So, Ember was 4 years old in February, and by any measure that the valley's ranchers applied to such things, he had become the territory's most significant breeding animal. The Territorial Breeding Association had placed his certified offspring in operations as far as 50 miles distant. Pruitt had come back twice, once to expand the documentation agreement, once to propose a formal breeding lease for a cattle concern north of Denver that wanted exclusive access to 3 of Ember's breeding seasons. She declined the exclusivity and negotiated a partial access agreement that left her direct valley arrangements intact, which Pruitt had accepted with the professional equanimity of a man who had stopped being surprised by her positions. The money was real now, not comfortable forever money, not the kind that removed the daily arithmetic. She still ran her ledger every Sunday morning, still measured the water tanks, still calculated feed costs against likely revenues with the pencil and the specific attention she'd been applying to these numbers since the first winter alone. But she was not afraid of the bank anymore. She had paid off the land twice over in accumulated value, and the land was unambiguously hers, and the operation she ran on it had a shape and a reputation that had been built from nothing by nobody but her. She was not particularly proud of this in the way that people expected her to be proud. Pride, she'd found, was what you felt when you'd accomplished something you'd been trying to accomplish. What she felt about the past 4 years was something quieter and harder to name. The feeling of having been tested repeatedly by things that could have ended her and having not ended. That wasn't pride. It was more like the way a fence post felt about still being in the ground. The difficulty she hadn't resolved, or rather, the difficulty that resolved itself in the form she least expected, was the question of what she owed the valley and what the valley owed her. It came up in April, at a meeting of the valley's ranchers that Burl Sampson organized in the back room of the Marsden feed store. Not a legal meeting, not a formal body, just 8 ranchers in a room with chairs that didn't all match, and a stove that ran too hot, and a question on the table about water rights, and how the valley was going to manage a second drought if one came before the creek fully recovered. She was the only woman in the room. She had been the only woman in every difficult room in the past 4 years, and she'd stopped finding this remarkable and started finding it simply tiring in the low-grade way of things you can't change and which don't change. Burl ran the meeting without ceremony, which she appreciated. The question was practical: a drainage system that would channel runoff from the upper valley into a communal holding area during heavy rain, reducing the crash and dry cycle that had made the creek so vulnerable. It required cooperation across property lines and investment from operations of varying capacity, and it required someone to be trusted with the management of the shared resource. Burl put the management question to the room directly. Several names were discussed. Then Cord Neely said, without elaborate framing, "Maria should do it." The room was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'm not looking to take on anyone else's problems. You're already the most organized operation in the valley," Cord said. "You've got the Denver connection, you've got the water experience, and you've already been giving water away for free for a year, which means you've been managing a shared resource without a title." He paused. "We'd pay you a management fee from the shared fund." "It's not about the money," she said. "I know," he said. "It's about whether you want to do it." She looked around the room. Frank Dowd, McRae, Burl. The man from the north end whose name she now knew was Will Garrett. Different Garrett, she'd confirmed, and 3 others. These were not her friends, most of them. They were her neighbors, which was different and in some ways more durable. They were people she'd fought with and refused and outnegotiated and fed water to and helped through a crisis. And they were sitting in this room asking her to be the person responsible for something that mattered to all of them. She thought about what she'd said to Cord at her kitchen table in October. "You can't build a life on land where everyone around you has failed." She'd said it then, and she'd meant it then, and she meant it now, and the logical extension of meaning it was sitting in this room and saying yes. "All right," she said, "with conditions." "Name them," Burl said. She named them. There were reasonable conditions: clear accounting, decisions made by consensus on major expenditures, her management role subject to annual review by the group. Nobody objected. Cord said the conditions were more conservative than he'd expected, which she took as a compliment even though she wasn't sure he'd intended it as one. She rode home from Marsden in the late afternoon with the April light doing what it did on the valley floor, lengthening everything, making the distances look larger and more possible than they did in the flat glare of noon. And she thought about the distance between where she'd been and where she was, and it was a distance she couldn't quite hold in her mind all at once. She was at Ember's fence on an evening in early May when she let herself look at it directly. This was unusual for her. She was not a woman who spent much time looking backward, not because the past wasn't real, but because the past didn't require her attention the way the present did. But that evening, with the light going gold on the mountains, and Ember grazing slowly along the far edge of the enclosure, and the valley spread out below her in its recovering green, she let the whole 4 years come into the room of her mind at once. The February morning. The mud. The 40 pounds of dying calf that she'd picked up off the creek bank because she couldn't walk away from something that was still breathing. She'd been so tired that morning. Tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been managing alone for too long and wasn't sure how much longer they could keep managing. She'd buried her husband, kept the land, kept the accounts, kept going, and she'd been so tired that her hands had been shaking before she even got out of bed, and then she'd seen the shape by the water, and she'd put her coat on the ground, and she hadn't thought about whether it was practical. That was the thing she came back to, standing at the fence at the end of 4 hard years. Not the resilience. Everyone talked about resilience, and it was a real thing, but it wasn't the first thing. The first thing was that she hadn't calculated. She'd just gone. She hadn't saved Ember because she saw an opportunity. She hadn't built the reservoirs because she'd done a market analysis on water futures. She hadn't refused Roland's offers because she'd projected forward to a Denver contract. She'd done all of it because she'd made a decision at the creek bank on a February morning that some things were worth saving regardless of whether saving them was going to work out, and everything else had followed from that. This was, she understood, not a lesson you could tell someone and have it mean anything. You could tell a person that the discarded thing has value, that the dying thing might live, that the ground everyone has written off might be the ground worth staying on. People would nod. They would understand the words. And then they would walk past the next dying calf because the calculation didn't favor stopping, and they would be rational and reasonable and wrong, in that particular way of being wrong that cost you nothing in the immediate moment and everything over time. She had not been reasonable that February morning. She was glad she hadn't been. Ember came to the fence, and she scratched behind his ears in the specific way he'd always preferred. and he tolerated this with the dignified patience of an animal who understood that the human had certain needs and was prepared to accommodate them within reason. He was enormous. Standing next to him was like standing next to something that had been built rather than born. And yet she remembered exactly how he'd felt in her arms in that first walk across the frozen pasture, all 40 pounds of wet and shivering and unwilling to stop, pressed against her chest, smelling of creek mud and birth, and the particular determination of things that were not ready to be over. She wondered sometimes if he remembered anything, not in the way people remembered with narrative and meaning attached, but in the body's way, the cellular way, the way a scar remembered an injury without the pain. Whether somewhere in the specific calm he carried, there was the encoding of being picked up when he was too weak to stand, of a rag soaked in warm milk pressed against his mouth in the dark of a cold cabin, of a voice saying, "I've got you. You're all right." She didn't know. She would never know. But she liked to think there was some version of knowing in him that matched some version of knowing in her, that the two of them had arrived at this fence on this May evening through a particular shared passage, and that the passage had made them both what they were. She was 41 years old. She owned 40 acres outright, plus the future inheritance of Otto's 80. She managed a valley water cooperative and a certified breeding program and a herd that had grown from 2 goats and a dying calf to 22 animals on her own land, and dozens more carrying her bloodline across the territory. She did her accounts on Sunday mornings and checked the water tanks every day and rode to Marsden twice a month and visited Otto twice a week, and had a reputation in the valley that she had not designed but which had been built from how she'd actually behaved under pressure, which was the only reputation she considered worth having. She was tired in the way she was always tired, the productive kind of tired that came from working days, not the hollow kind that came from being afraid. There was a difference. She knew it now in a way she hadn't 4 years ago. None of it had gone the way she'd planned because she hadn't had a plan. She'd had a coat she'd put down in the mud and a dying calf and the stubbornness to keep doing the next thing, even when the next thing was hard and expensive and embarrassing and the whole valley was laughing at her. And now the valley wasn't laughing. Otto came by the following Sunday. He walked from his place, which he'd been doing lately on good mornings, the 2 miles between the properties a thing he seemed to need in a way that he didn't articulate. She made coffee. She'd picked up a new bag from Marsden on Thursday, and they sat on the porch in the morning sun. "The Trescott boy," Otto said. "Peter? His wife had the baby last week, both well." "Agnes told me," Mireia said. "They've named it for the valley. Callaway," Otto said. He tried the name. "It is a good name." She thought about Peter Trescott standing at her east tank with 4 wooden barrels, asking what she wanted for the water with the voice of a man who'd been preparing himself to pay something he wasn't sure he had. She thought about his wife holding the youngest on her hip. She thought about how ordinary that moment had been and how it hadn't felt ordinary to either of them. "People survive things," she said, "and then they name the next thing after the place where they survived them." Otto looked at her. "Is that what you would do?" She thought about it, about what she would name something if she were naming a thing that had come after everything she'd survived. "No," she said. "I'd name it Ember." Otto was quiet for a moment. Then he made the sound that was not quite a laugh. "Yes," he said. "This is correct." They drank their coffee. Down in the east enclosure, the black bull moved through the morning light with his usual unhurried authority, and his coat caught the sun the way it always did. Not reflecting it, exactly, but holding it, the way deep water held light, like something that had learned to keep what it needed. The mountains behind him were still capped with snow that would melt into the creek through summer, slow and steady and sufficient, the way water moved when the season was honest. The valley was green below. The fence posts were solid and good ground. Mireia Holloway sat on her porch and drank her coffee and did not think about the future for once, because the future could wait. It would come regardless. It always did. What was here, right now, was enough.